Individuals falling prey to different forms of crime or harm often find themselves being held partially or even entirely responsible for the mishaps that occur to them, a concept known as victim blaming. This prejudice practice is particularly prominent with the victims of sex crimes or domestic violence, especially if the victim and perpetrator knew each other prior to the crime. There are entrenched notions that tend to accuse rape victims more than robbery victims. For instance, William Ryan, a psychologist, popularized the term blaming the victim in his 1971 publication. The book portrayed victim blaming as an ideology utilized as a justification for racial prejudice and societal inequity against African Americans in the United States. Ryan's work was a critique of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's controversial 1965 work, The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, commonly known as the Moynihan Report. In his report, Moynihan concluded that centuries of oppression and uniquely harsh American slavery system had disrupted and destabilized the black family structure, resulting in higher incidences of unwed mothers, absent fathers, and single-parent households among African Americans. He related these adverse family outcomes to the relatively lower employment rates, educational attainment, and financial successes among the black population. He further discussed the negative portrayal of black families in media and its influence on children. He then suggested government interventions to support the traditional black nuclear family. Ryan, however, asserted that Moynihan wrongly traced the difficulties faced by African Americans to the prevalence of unstable family structures and the dependence on government aid. According to Ryan, such theories shift the responsibility of poverty from societal structural factors to the behavior and cultural patterns of the deprived. Ryan wasn't the first to address victim blaming. Earlier in 1947, scholar Theodore W. Adorno had coined it as a key characteristic of the fascist mindset. His research further linked contempt for the weak or discriminated as a common trait of fascism. The view that victims asked for it epitomizes the victim blaming mindset. One proposed explanation for this trend of victim blaming is the just world hypothesis, suggesting that individuals refuse to accept the randomness of undeserved hardship on others, thus blaming victims for their plight. Acting appropriately, therefore, is seen as a safeguard against victimization. This ancient concept gained relevance in modern social psychology in the 1960s, spearheaded by Melvin J. Lerner. Those blighted in such societies may confront myriad adversities. Among them are seclusion, corporeal and psychological maltreatment, social stigmatization, public ridicule, rejection by kin and companions, prohibition from matrimony, and in previously wedded instances, divorce. Abhorrently, death can be the ultimate penalty. Astoundingly, even in more progressive nations, notably portions of the U.S., the pernicious societal scourge of misogyny stubbornly persists. A 2009 investigation published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence studying male sexual assault victims revealed the victim blaming phenomenon is largely underpinned by societal conceptions of masculinity. Hallmark consequences of such violations are a diminished sense of manliness, uncertainty surrounding sexual identity, and a feeling of failure to adhere to traditional gender roles. Victims often grapple with severe psychological afflictions such as depression or rape-induced PETS termed rape trauma syndrome. Blame is often apportioned to female victims on the basis of their attire at the time of the assault, with critics asserting that provocative clothing is suggestive of sexual consent. Irrespective of verbal affirmation, however, evidence to correlate clothing style as a key factor in assaults is yet to be established. Blaming the victim also arises when a victim's actions, which may have inhibited their capacity to resist or decline consent like alcohol consumption, are deemed as fault. Efforts to combat this are underway, with victim advocacy groups and medical professionals elevating societal understanding about the specifics of sexual consent, primarily aiming to dissuade victim blaming. Legislative, educational, and medical institutions are increasingly endorsing the concept of affirmative consent and advocating for abstinence from sexual activity when under the influence. Defense strategies often dishonor and disquiet victims, often dissecting their personal history, making them feel so uncomfortable they opt to dismiss the proceedings. By tainting the victim's character, usually by casting aspersions on promiscuity or drug use, defense persuades the universal belief that women with high-risk tendencies are not genuine victims. Recent studies suggest correlation between general sexism and acceptance of rape myths leading to victim blaming. The very concept of the ideal victim attributes victimhood status due to unavoidable circumstances leading to their vulnerability. Noted criminologist Niels Christie propounded this theory, illustrating it with two contrasting examples. One, an elderly woman assaulted while returning from a family visit, and second, a young man assaulted in a bar by an acquaintance. Christie posits the woman to be the ideal victim due to her inability to avoid the location or the attacker and her inability to fend him off. Unlike the man who could have evaded the bar and presumably have been able to thwart his familiar attacker, let's discuss the societal perception of victims, focusing particularly on those involved in sexually abusive incidents. It explores how certain lifestyles and behaviors are wrongly deemed as high risk, potentially compromising the credibility of their testimonies, and hence their chances of justice in court. The story delves particularly into scenarios involving intimacy between the victim and perpetrator, which are dismissed as non-ideal, making a case of justice even more challenging. The narrative also explores the flawed notion of the ideal perpetrator, suggesting that society tends to view those unknown to the victim and devoid of morals as true culprits. It thus discounts cases of intimate partner violence on the grounds of familiarity. The story further sheds light on global attitudes towards victim blaming, elucidating how it is deeply embedded in various cultures. Contextual examples include sexual abuse victims in Somalia, women freed from captivity by Boko Haram in Nigeria, acid attack victims in South Asia, and sexual assault victims in China. These cases depict a blatant violation of human rights as victims are marginalized, ostracized, and even held accountable for the crimes committed against them. While Western societies have traditionally taken cognizance of the problem with victim blaming, the narrative ends by acknowledging that Westerners are not devoid of these reprehensible perceptions. Consequently, the narrative paints a stark picture of the inherent biases and stereotypes stigmatizing victims worldwide, impairing their pursuit of justice and underscoring the pervasive culture of victim blaming. Social and personality psychologist Roy Baumeister has postulated that victims may sometimes play a part in their victimization, challenging the universally accepted trope of the innocence of victims. In his critique of what he terms the myth of pure evil, Baumeister suggests that narratives of violence often depict victims as innocent individuals preyed upon by malevolent perpetrators. However, he postulates that this perception can be distorted, both by the accused seeking to downplay their actions and the victims exaggerating them, making it difficult to discern the objective truth. Baumeister also addresses a psychological pattern called moral complexity, where the aggressors perceive themselves as the real victims, justifying heinous deeds based on perceived insults. This pattern is particularly noticeable among abusive husbands, fueling their excessive reaction to what they perceive as provocation. Simultaneously, the review by Lennon et al. In 2017 presented the idea of self-objectification among women. They elaborated that when women dress provocatively or sexually, they invite anxiety, dissatisfaction, shame, and violence, including unwanted touching and sexual coercion. However, they also noted that very few studies truly explore the relationship between dress code, actual sexual behavior, and violence. Annette Lynch's 2007 investigation counters this trend, highlighting how suggestive behavior, coupled with attire, can provoke unwanted advances. Notably, a horseshoe theory argument has been put forth by some scholars as well. They postulate that both the beliefs that lead to victim blaming and the counter-arguments are extreme and resemble each other. One side suggests that provocatively dressed women invite sexual assault, which depicts men as incapable of sexual self-control and denies them agency. On the flip side, assuming that women never lie about rape is seen as harmful to women, as it denies their individual agency by pigeonholing them into simplistic roles. This debate addresses gender stereotypes broadly, as well as their role in shaping our perception of violence. The narrative presents a critique of the role of psychologists in legal proceedings and lays emphasis on the resistances they face from both feminists as well as men's rights advocates. It brings to the fore instances where psychologists' evaluations of female physical attributes have influenced judicial verdicts on adult ratings for pornographic cartoons and statutory rape cases. While this has often led to lauding by feminists or men's rights groups, it has been labeled as victim blaming based on physical appearance by academia. The narrative also delves into the potential hazards of biopsychiatric models that position sexual criminality as a hereditary trait, and the consequent victim blaming experienced by incest abuse sufferers. The theoretical support of these models from some feminists is said to discourage victims from reporting the abuse due to apprehensions of being held responsible for their genetic relations to the perpetrator. The perspective of analysts challenging conventional dynamics of victim blaming is also discussed. They argue that the focus on victim reporting as primary evidence of crime overlooks other possible avenues, such as patrol checks, witnesses, or potential anonymous reports made by bystanders or neighbors. They also express concerns about offender profiling, whereby the potential and likelihood of a person to commit a crime often influences the credibility given to the victim's report. It further highlights international comparative studies indicating no significant variance in rates of successful prosecution of male on female domestic violence cases between countries adhering to feminist or anti-feminist theory, asserting that this disclosure exonerates evolutionary psychology of being any less culpable than gender feminism for undue prioritization of cases by the criminal justice system, thereby leaving many such cases with female aggressors undeterred. The narrative concludes with a proposition of randomized investigation as an alternative to psychological profiling suspected offenders, claiming the latter contributes to the issues frequently attributed to victim blaming. Leigh Renee Mears, known as Lay, a 14-year-old Australian adolescent who met a violent death, becomes the primary focus of this storyline. The murder took place on November 3, 1989 in her hometown of Fern Bay, New South Wales. Leigh was attending a birthday bash hosted by a boy turning 16 at Stockton Beach. The narrative takes a tragic turn when Leigh is attacked by a group of male participants after distressingly escaping a non-consensual beachside course of sexual conduct. So judged by a magistrate later brutally kicked and spat upon, Leigh departs from the revelry only for her lifeless, unclothed form to be discovered amidst the sand dunes the next day. The revelation of her horrific state, involving severe damage to her genitals and a crushed skull, attracted significant media scrutiny. The story told by the media gradually moved from the central events of her sexual assault and consequent murder to concentrate more on questions surrounding lack of parental oversight, the influence of narcotics and alcohol, and Leigh's sexual orientation further. The media's representation of the crime has been critiqued and cited as recurring victim blaming, bringing infamous Australian Senator Fraser Anning into focus. He drew severe criticism over his comments pertaining to the horrific mosque assaults in Christchurch, New Zealand, and situation of the murder of 51 Muslim faithful. He spurred controversy when he linked the attacks to the incoming Muslim fanatics, and controversially argued of an increasing apprehension amongst local communities towards the escalating Muslim populace. His comments drew international backlash, regarded as insensitive, racially discriminative, and concordant with the abhorrent perspectives of the attacker. Speaking of legal frameworks in common law jurisdictions like the UK, Canada, and a few Australian states, the murder defense provocation can only reduce the conviction to manslaughter. Traditionally, criminal courts have viewed sexual unfaithfulness, such as infidelity and fornication, as alarming provocation to warrant such reductions. Seeing it as a moral warrant, this warrant has found its way into reduced responsibility defenses and other severe bodily harm and murder attempts. Most noticeably, cases of provocation, though attempts to control these defenses have been made by law authorities and reformers, the contention remains prevalent. The start of 2016 in Germany brought another incident to light involving Henrietta Recker, the mayor of Cologne. Following multiple sexual assaults on New Year's Eve, her response was widely condemned as she seemed to put the blame on the victims. She advocated for a code of conduct for women, suggesting they should maintain an arm's length from strangers, provoking widespread criticism as a response to the escalating situation. She convened an emergency meeting with the police. However, her attempts to separate the attacks from the refugees were deemed as completely improper. Lastly, the narrative touches upon the 2016 case of Ashley Ann Olsen, an American who was murdered during a sexually oriented interaction with a Senegalese immigrant in Italy. The media portrayal was primarily focused on the victim blaming in these cross-cultural encounters. Numerous women posted pictures online showcasing their audacious attires and staying out late night, actions conventionally rebuked by a primitive anti-feminist mindset. Highlighting historic bias in media, the Madeira Tribune in 1938 carried a piece about the stabbing of a 19-year-old Leona Vloot, where the mother partially blamed her daughter due to her drinking habits. Rodney Gregg, the man behind the murder, was subsequently found guilty and executed. In 2010, continuing the theme of victim blaming, a defense attorney in a Texas rape case described an 11-year-old victim of multiple gang rapes as a seductress, enhancing the narrative of victims bearing the blame in such horrendous crimes. An uncritical New York Times article reporting community members blaming the victim caused the newspaper to later apologize. The same victim blaming trend is visible in urban design favoring car mobility, with the majority of accidents involving cars. Despite this, infrastructure often obstructs pedestrians and cyclist movement, leading to blaming victims of accident. However, measures should be taken to temper traffic, ensuring the safe mobility of vulnerable pedestrians and cyclists to prevent victim blaming from becoming the norm.